on this computer. Okay. Yeah. So once again, everybody, welcome. This is the second session of the joint EAAFP and ITTEA virtual workshop on market surveys for addressing illegal take of migratory birds. For those who were not here last time, I am Susan Tsang. I'm the coordinator of the ITTEA, and I am moderating today's workshop and doing a lot of the instruction for it. But I would also like to point out my colleagues here, Ding Li from BirdLife International, who most of you know actually. And then also Tillman, who is from CMS. He's the Associate Program Officer. And in the audience is also my research assistant, Mimi, who, Mimi, can you just wave your hand real quick? So if anybody feels like asking questions in Malay or Indonesian, we are cool with that because she will just tell me if she can just read it off in English basically to the crowd. So that is much easier for some people. That's perfectly fine. And yeah, and Clary actually, who was here last time also, is actually the coordinator for the Mediterranean Task Force on illegal take of migratory birds. So thank you for coming today, even though you are off.
Thank you.
And welcome everybody again for coming. I deeply appreciate that you are still interested in this topic. Today will be much more technical compared to last time. So, you know, ask questions. You know, I think that it's fine for us to spend a little bit of time and pause and talk and make sure everybody understands things. So if necessary, if you feel like you don't understand something, you want to raise your hand, you can do that. And, you know, if I don't immediately get to it, then Mimi can kind of jump in and she can read off the questions from chat for me. In this particular session, we are going to be focused very much so on aspects that we started talking about last time, and including more information also about motivation surveys. And I wanted to add a few things actually about online surveys that we haven't really talked very much about. From the presenters today, I think this is a discussion period also. It's not just for us to talk to you, it's us to also hear back from everybody. We want people to engage with us. We want people to come in and be able to share their own experiences if they have any as well. And if the first thing I can ask all of you to do, because there are more people than I thought there would be, if you could quickly in chat just type your name and where you're from, like what country you work or what country you work in, and also what is your level of experience with doing any kind of surveys, like market surveys, net surveys, motivation surveys, online surveys, anything like that. Just how much experience do you have with it? Because there are things that we're going to go over that are very foundational to any kind of survey, and then there's things that we're going to go over that are more specific to the different kinds of surveys that I mentioned. So I would really appreciate if everybody could just type that in very quickly and just, you know, it would be a way for me to understand how much I should explain certain things and how much I can move on quickly so that we can actually get to material that people might have more trouble with. And yeah, just, you know, if you have any questions, just feel free to ask. It's totally fine for you to type it or just raise your hand and say it. I'm okay with either. And yeah, so I just want to give everybody a moment to do that if they can in chat for some of the participants, because a bunch of you I know came last time and I don't know all of you very well, obviously. So, you know, if you feel comfortable doing that, that'd be great. Okay. Okay, great. We have a lot of people from different places already. I'm seeing on mine. So yeah, so we have folks from Singapore, BirdLife International. And for folks who are coming in right now, I'm just asking people to type in chat where they're from, what experience they have with any kinds of surveys, and you know, anything related to either market surveys, net surveys, motivation surveys, online surveys, anything like that, just so I know where people have some experience and where we need to actually cover more ground. So I'll be looking at that in chat a little bit as we go along. But the first part, I just wanted to do a very, very quick recap. I sent all of you a link earlier with the Zoom link as well, which is a Dropbox where I have put a bunch of material that is for today. That will be just examples that we're going to talk about later on in like about an hour and a half or so. And also some of the major documents basically that you can get them freely, but just, you know, put them in one place is a little bit easier for me to do an instructional course for that. So if you look in that folder, the first thing that you will see is actually the guidelines from BirdLife International. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hold on a second. And you should find this file, which is the best practice guide for monitoring illegal killing and taking of birds from BirdLife International. It is very useful, and it will be a very basic foundation that we will speak of most things about today, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I think that this is something that you can get access to easily online, since it is just on their website, but I have also included it in the Dropbox for you. There's a couple of files there that as we get through the day, then I will talk about them more. But yeah, this is the first thing. And just as a very, beginning step, what we really need to do is talk about best practices. And so I'm going to open with that. And let me just, okay, I have to, geez. Okay. So yeah, best practices. I'm going to just do a very quick overview again of the 4 types of surveys. Last time we had Dingley give us an overview of the market surveys that he's done in many different countries in Indochina. Oh, there's a time playing for some reason. And then also Rong An Kao, who is a PhD candidate from Thailand, has also talked about her net survey research in agricultural landscapes. And today I will also talk about motivational surveys and also online surveys a little bit. I don't have slides for online surveys because there are considerations related to that I think showing you websites actually makes it a little easier. But the motivation surveys, I will give some examples because I actually want to speak more specifically to something where I have exact experience. The examples will be on bats because I am mostly working from a world of a slightly different flying species. So one of the most basic things that we're going to make sure that we cover when we're talking about these surveys is defining these survey objectives at the outset, understanding what questions are monitoring, who's involved in legal take, who is engaging in it, who would the results be and how, right? So, oh my gosh, I don't know why this is playing. Okay, so I'm just going to go back one slide. This is kind of a mess today. And when we go through each of the different things that go into a survey, I want you to keep them in mind as a way for you to understand, okay, what am I trying to do actually here, right? What step am I at? What am I missing in terms of information? What do I actually need to get? Because you do need to define your objectives very clearly on the outset if you want to be productive and effective in the type of work, type of data that you're going to take back in. I also wanted to just very quickly mention that in terms of the terminology, the accuracy and precision question will come up a lot. I don't know why this is happening where my talk is, sorry about this. My talk is for some reason playing like a regular slideshow for some reason. Okay, so accuracy is how close to the estimate is your true value. So I have these charts here as a way for you to understand if you don't. Oh my Lord, I don't know what's up with this. Give me 1 second. This is the worst time to have this problem. I'm just going to very quickly export this as a PDF and I will reopen that. Good thing I am editing this video before I send it and it'll go onto our page, so it's fine. Give me 1 second. This is a slightly different way. Just the full screen. Okay. So yeah, accuracy is how close it is to the true value. So you want to be accurate in your surveys because you want to make sure that the data that you have from your surveys actually reflect what is actually happening. And then precision is how close the estimates are to one another. So if, surveyor A and surveyor B have very different levels of precision, like they don't get the same thing when they go out and survey the same people, then that is actually a problem for your data and you need to know that. And so obviously, if you can be accurate and precise, that is the best, but often you will find that perhaps you might not have accuracy or precision because of various reasons during your pilot survey, and that you need to address those issues before you actually go on to do your full study. And I may be using these terms sometimes when I talk about the different surveys. And so I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page about what they mean. If you are looking at sampling strategy, though, you will oftentimes find that you will talk about random sampling and regular sampling. And the goal of sampling is always to try to find a representative sample. So the difference between random sampling and regular sampling is that random sampling actually just means that every unit in a population has an equal chance of being selected. And if you have a regular sample, you actually just have a very organized grid, for instance, and you decide that there's a certain interval in which you sample everything. So this figure is actually from the guidelines document I mentioned earlier from BirdLife International, just so it's familiar to you if you see that again later. And this is oftentimes usually a way that ecologists will go out to do their studies, or how if you go to, let's say, a market, that's how you select, which area you want to work at, for instance, or which markets you want to go to, or something of that sort, where you actually have a system and you decide that beforehand as well. A lot of times you'll also see that people actually use stratified sampling when you do hunting, because you want to make sure that you have, the hunters equally represented compared to the consumers, for instance, and you just want to make sure that you are able to separate them in some way that actually is very clearly defined. So when you choose a strata, what happens is you actually can minimize that variation within the strata, but it actually maximizes it between it. So the strata usually select a trait that is very distinctive, like they won't overlap, right? So for instance, if this red and blue is here, let's say it's men and women, and they don't overlap as easily. And so you sample from that to get your actual sample size. And that is not to be confused with clustering, which is, also one more thing. Stratified sampling is also, because your landscape is heterogeneous, it is not, equal across the landscape often, then you can actually choose to sample proportionately to the size of the strata that you chose. And in the example that's given in the guidelines from BirdLife, they actually show you, there is an area that is illegal activity is present and illegal activity is purportedly absent in the one on the bottom. But they don't want to just sample and end up getting most of their sample sites in the place where it's absent, because that's not what the goal is of their work. And so they will change it so that they can proportionately take more from where it's actually happening at. And so there's also other ways to decide how you decide how much to sample per strata. It's just, there's many different ways. And that is another very more complicated stats question that I won't get into unless you're interested. And yeah, like I mentioned, it should not be confused with cluster sampling, which is when you have a full population, but when you're taking those subgroups, instead of pre-separating them into some, specific kind of subgroup, you just randomly are clustering them. So you just grab, 3 people out of 10, and you just grab another 3 people out of 10, but you don't know necessarily if they are hunters or if they are consumers that you're actually looking for, or if they're mixed together, or if they're all, put together. So this is usually sometimes confused with stratified sampling when people talk about it, because they are not actually presupposing that these people belong to any subgroup. You're just sampling from those to make their full sample at the end. And in working on things like hunting, you often will see that people talk about snowball sampling, which is a non-random sampling method. So that means that not every single person in the population has an equal chance of being selected. And usually that is the case when you have issues that are hard to talk to people about, like they're sensitive topics, or you have a population that's just hard to access as well. So if you have a hunter, and it is, what you're talking about is illegal technically, and they don't really want to talk to you, then, you can't find another hunter. But let's say he knows them because he's like, oh yeah, I hang out with this guy and this guy. So he can introduce you to more people. And then as you talk to those folks, they can actually introduce you to more people. And so that's snowball, it gets bigger and bigger. So you'll see this a lot when you talk about hunting, just because of the nature of this particular topic. The other thing I wanted to mention is also that it's really important to train your surveyors. So I think today is a little bit of that as well, because we're trying to ensure that you have an understanding of the methodology and the rationale and, the value of what we're doing, and understand to some degree why this is very necessary to the combating illegal take of birds. But also you just want to know, like, if you're working in an area, what is legal and what is illegal. And if you are out there to be safe, that you should always be ready for if there is some illegal activity that you encounter, what you should actually be doing. You want to make sure that everybody is very able to actually effectively communicate what your study is about, because oftentimes you do talk to community members where if you're not really used to doing outreach and you use too much jargon, then people will not actually be able to understand what you're doing, and you are not actually helping them help you also. So you want to be able to, make sure that you can actually explain things. And also just when you are talking to people, just make sure that you are aware of any security issues. If there's like paperwork you have to sign beforehand, like permits or anything else, or consent forms, like just make sure you have that squared away and you know that beforehand. It's not surprising to you. Then, if later you didn't have the paperwork, you have to throw the data out. And just, I think this is a good time to also mention that when we're doing the training, it's a time to share and discuss with one another any experiences that people have. And if they have questions about difficult situations that they've run into, then we can talk about that together as a way for us to better understand how we can overcome those issues. Because you'll find that there are very similar issues across the board for a lot of different people. And you will find yourself, hearing somebody say like, oh, this and this happened to me, and I think it's only at my site, but it's actually, you're like, oh, this also happens at my site, but I just didn't know that because we are in two very different localities and we've never met each other before. So this is an opportunity to do some of that discussion. And also later on, I will have a list of all the participants, and you can all email each other if you wanted to, or get in contact with one another. So, just this is a platform for everybody to have that time to talk with one another. So I'm gonna quickly hand it over to Ding Li now, who's gonna talk more broadly about other general guidelines.
Thanks, Susan, for the background on sampling and some of those lessons and tips that you have picked up from your work in different parts of Southeast Asia. I have a couple of slides as well. They pretty much augment what you have already covered, and it's kind of a continuation of the presentation I've done last week, which was about market surveys and some of the do's and don'ts and tips and tricks as to how you could conduct a market survey as best as you can without having too many hiccups. So what I'll do is to give the floor a bit of a recap, really a bit of a revisit of some of the stuff that I've covered last week. And then I have a couple of slides just to share with the floor a little bit of our experiences in planning those surveys in the region, considering the social economic context of different Asian countries we have worked in. So I'm just going to keep this rather short, but first of all, let me share my screen.
Yeah, I think it's also good for you to go over some of that, just because there are a lot of people that were not here last week that are here today. That doing that very brief recap might be very useful for them as well.
Sounds good. Thanks, Susan. Yep. So just a bit of a quick revisit of my presentation last week. Thanks to all of you who were able to join us for last week's session. I hope you've learned quite a bit from our own experiences, and also from my colleague Rong Rong, who has done some really extensive work in central Thailand, which is obviously a region that deserves further monitoring and, of course, stronger conservation efforts. My presentation, like I say, will be a bit of a recap. So first and foremost, what did we learn from the market surveys that BirdLife International and several of our NGO partners were able to pick up from the last 2 or 3 years of this work, including our collaboration with WCS in Laos? I think a few broad strokes, things that we could take away. We have now got a better understanding of the different taxas that are taken in the region, and obviously it's not rocket science. Whatever kind of environment that we do these market surveys in, the surrounding landscapes are often the source of where much of the wildlife come from. We don't typically expect wildlife to be transported over large distances for local sale at market. So if you are working in a landscape in a town where surrounding areas are mostly paddy fields and grassland, then you should be expecting to pick up a lot of wetland bird. But on the other hand, if you are working in landscapes that are very much forested landscapes, then you should be expecting and preparing yourself to see more of these different forest species in the kinds of vendors that you find in the market. So in our field work that we've conducted, we've also found a broad sweep of taxonomic groups that have been that are showing in markets across the region. So we've got shorebirds in intertidal flats. Obviously, these are from towns that are not so far from the coast. In towns that are not so far from paddy fields, you get lots of rails and crigs and bitterns and herons and egrets. And closer to the mountains in the inland areas of Vietnam and Laos, I think our experience was that we find a lot of passerines and other sorts of forest species like hornbills and broadbills in these market surveys. We also learned that the scale of bird hunting, or should I say, uh, the sale of birds for avian meat is particularly prevalent in Southeast Asia. This is, of course, something again that is not new because there's a lot of work that has been already carried out in the last 10 years or even more, looking at mammal surveys by various NGOs. But the scale of the avian meat trade is something that surprised us quite a bit. And we obviously see that there's a great urgency for NGOs, conservationists working in the region to pay close attention to the avian meat trade and understanding the different contexts and peculiarities of this trade in different countries in Southeast Asia, especially in the 5, 6 countries of Indo-Burma. We see that in countries such as Vietnam, much of this sale is still very much in very open and upfront circumstances, whereas the scale of this is more scattered in Myanmar. But of course, it is still a very widespread problem in much of the Burmese countryside. A few lessons that we've learned from our work, like many of you here, I'm not an expert on doing market surveys. So the work that we undertook in the various countries, we picked up a lot and how we could improve these surveys in the future to capture data better. I think one of the biggest challenges that we had when we did this work was that we were unable to compute turnover, and turnover actually would be very important for us to have a better understanding of the total volume at the annual level of the different species that was hunted. So that's a huge challenge. We find that we are constrained by resources very much, and so much of what we are really throwing out what you will consider to be snapshot types of surveys. So you just take a snap at what is available at a particular time of the year. From our experiences on the ground, we also find that there were lots of challenges for us in species identification. A lot of times we assume that we could send very good bird watchers to the ground to figure out the trait, but often in our experience, we find that the conditions are totally different, and a lot of the species that are being traded, they do not look like what they were, when they were alive. So this is something that I think all people, colleagues working on market survey should be aware of in this region. I think to some extent, the people who are selling and trading in wildlife, they are also aware that they are being surveyed, and they know that this could possibly be more challenging for people like us to collect data. We should also be mindful of our expectations when we are doing these surveys. For example, we may go out into the field having that impression that every market that you visit will have a wildlife being openly traded, but that's not the case. In our experience, we find that often it's the minority of vendors, and in fact, we believe that our work showed us that a lot of this is not very um, obvious and open. It's very much clandestine. So often you don't expect your market survey results to be telling you exactly what the scale of different wildlife species being traded are. We learned that, of course, wildlife is often also sold alongside other products that people will buy in the market. So you shouldn't be running around markets looking for shops selling just wildlife. You should be looking at stalls that sell vegetables, fish, and other sorts of meat. So a few key things that we've learned from our experiences back in 2019, 2020, and 2021. There are some resources out there for us to figure out these market surveys better. But to be honest, my experience and that of our colleagues was that there was a lot of work available on surveying the pet bird trade, for example, looking at live birds in different bird markets for songbird trade or and all that. But I think there's still very, very limited resources for you to conduct surveys of avian meat in different markets. One of the resources that I was able to share last week was this document that was produced by WCS Cambodia. I think it's probably the only document that explicitly can be used in the field to conduct surveys of avian meat. So coming back to planning and designing market surveys, my presentation here is not supposed to be a comprehensive primer on how you do these surveys, but more of looking at the lessons that we have learned from our experiences, and also helping you to get a bit of the broad framework of your survey work going in the field. There's a few key points that I have taken here, and again, these are very much broad strokes. First and foremost, I think when you plan a market survey, the most important step is to be clear what you are surveying for, and of course, with that, that will guide the overall design and development of the way you do your survey protocol. Of course, thinking about your resources, you may want your surveys to be very much snapshot, and most market surveys, as you can see in this region, are snapshot types of surveys. Longitudinal surveys would take more time. They're way more challenging because you will need to revisit markets again and again. And over time, when the people in the market see you coming often, they might also respond and react in ways that impede your ability to collect good data. It's also very good, and it's also very important for you to think a little bit more about how you manage and share your data with your collaborators. Knowing well that some of the data that you collect from market and wildlife trade types of surveys can be quite sensitive. It needs to be managed and shared very, very carefully. Other things are very general. For example, when you plan your surveys, it's always good to figure out where these markets are and what are the time frame for your surveys. If you have time to do a bit of a recce visit, I think that is something that is strongly advised. I think in my work in Laos, for example, we were able to benefit very much from the work that our collaborators at WCS were already doing. So they had already mapped most of the key wildlife markets, and I think that made our job really straightforward. It was more about finding the smaller scale markets, which was a bit challenging, and snowball sampling, as Susan has mentioned earlier on, was a key step for us to track down some of these markets through getting information from people we meet in the markets. You could possibly also complement your market surveys with interview questionnaires. But interview questionnaires can work in your favor or against you, partly because it creates another dimension of your work, which means that there's more data that you have to mention to manage. But at the same time, you will also have to develop questionnaires in the local language. You will need to have interpreters with you, working with you closely to do the surveys. And one of the big challenges for us when we were doing the work in Southeast Asia was quite a lot of inertia or reluctance from local people to participate in those surveys, even though they were sometimes given written reassurances. I think the issue was about trust and how the information would be managed. So something for you to think about if you plan to run questionnaire types of interviews alongside a market survey. The logistics of it can be quite challenging. And of course, if you are thinking more about an academic kind of based research, you need to think a little bit more also about getting your permit sorted out, and animal ethics and human survey ethics if and when necessary. A few more other considerations that my various teams learned from our work in the countries we worked in. Some of these are super obvious, for example, and coming from BirdLife, obviously, my work was focused on avian species and more prominently migratory species. So you need to think a little bit about the seasonal nature of your surveys. If you want to look at migratory species being traded, don't do a survey in the middle of June because these species won't be here in the region. That's something quite obvious, but often it's also good for you to preempt and plan for what kinds of species that you're encountering. I think it's again not too difficult because there's always bits and pieces of work that's been done. Some of that has been published in the literature, and like what I mentioned earlier on, getting a sense of the landscape where you're going to do the market surveys will give you a very strong sense of what kind of species you're encountering. So if you're paddy field, if your markets are mostly in paddy field countryside, then you should brace yourself for more material on waterbird and the identification of different waterbird species. In our experience, we felt that it was really useful to consult local stakeholders. When we plan our work in Laos, WCS and BirdLife, we had lots of internal closed-door meetings with the provincial governments. We wanted to use our work to synergize as much as possible with what the government was already doing on enforcement and surveillance sort of work. So I think it was easy for us to get government support, and in many of these surveys we even had one or two officers from the departments accompanying us and bring us to places that we wouldn't have been aware of. So I think that was really important. It helped to strengthen our mandate for conducting surveys and searches of markets in certain parts of the country. In recent years, there's a lot of discourse about zoonotics and various wildlife diseases, I think in part triggered by the pandemic. So I think if you can organize and synergize and frame your work in relation to diseases and zoonotics, I think it would also help to strengthen that mandate for you to carry out these market surveys. And then, of course, moving on to my next point, when you do a survey, you are going to be confronted with data of many different taxonomic groups. As much as I and my colleagues were interested in bird data, looking for avian meat and all that sort of things, we did not exclude the possibility of collecting data on other textiles as well, partly because we saw the value of doing that. So my colleagues, we worked to collect data of mammals as well. We documented bats, small mammals, which were also amongst the frequently traded kinds of mammalian taxa in Indochina. And last of all, I think it's good for us to set your expectations right. Do not force yourself to get some amount of data because you don't really know the extent of some of these situations. I think it's good to go in with a managed sense of expectation. If you don't find, then that's it. I mean, you can always try to look for other sources of data, but it could just mean that area, that landscape they're working in is simply not a hotbed of wildlife trade. So I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. Really just to bring the floor up to speed on some of these considerations, and also to help you to plan your market surveys better, to guide whatever conservation projects you have on the ground. Yep. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks,
Over to you.
Yong. I also wanted to mention that in some of the synergies that he's mentioned, some of the examples that I've chosen will show that, especially for the disease aspect, for instance. That's very relevant to, for instance, when I work on bats. So this is a particular framing that I am very familiar with, and we will talk more about how people go about that as well. So today, we are also going to be moving on to all these examples, like I mentioned, but first I wanted to give a chance to also invite Dr. Dan Lian, who's an associate research scholar at Princeton University, to talk about the net surveys that he's conducted in China. And he will also discuss a little bit more generally about some of the backgrounds of how to do a net survey as well. So thank you, Dan, for staying up as late as I am on the East Coast, and I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks so much, Susan. So can I share my screen?
You should be able to share your screen at the bottom. There should be a green share screen. There you go.
All right. Can you see my screen now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me and for your introduction, Susan. Today I'm going to talk about shorebird mortalities across China's coast. We'll particularly focus on how we survey the net distributions and monitor the shorebird mortalities. We have learned a lot of lessons. For myself, I mean, because our protocol has shifted a little bit, in the process of doing this research, and I want to share some questions that I would like to ask and keep asking when I'm doing these netting surveys. So first is, I think Dean Lee has mentioned as well for the market survey. So what are the purpose of the study? Are you really like only want to know the net distribution, or you want to estimate the mortalities? And also, I think it's important to know the scale of the study, both spatial or temporal, because I mean, this is very important for migratory species. And also, I think we're all doing the sampling, but I keep asking like whether your sampling is representative enough. So we need to do some like randomization, as Susan has mentioned. And also, like, what's the survey unit? Actually, I only mentioned this the survey unit of the radar clam, the horizontal nets, but there are different net types. So the survey unit actually in my study was different. Probably like for the mist net the survey net is a single net, but for others it's probably every 100 meter of nets, and for the horizontal it's one square kilometer of nets. And then because if we want to calculate the mortality, there should be a lot of uncertainties to consider. So it may be good to have, like I just mentioned, it may be good to have a model in your mind when you are doing the survey, so that you can really know like what kind of data you want to collect and what you don't want to miss, right? Because and also how are you going to consider these uncertainties? So what I did is basically to replicate spatially, also temporally, when I'm doing the survey. Also, there is another like assumption, because we always have to make assumptions to. So actually, I have some. There was a story that I made an assumption for this radar clam netting, which turned out to be not a good assumption, and then I collected more data to correct my mortality estimation. But they are, the assumptions may lead underestimation or overestimation. So I think what we really want to avoid is the overestimation. We don't want to overstate the problem, right? And then it's the, when you are doing the survey, you sometimes, my like collaborators or field assistants, they want to, because they saw that the birds are like struggling on the nets. So should we remove the nets when the main purpose is to survey nets? So my answer is yes and no. So if this intervention or moving nets or release the birds will affect your survey. For instance, when I surveyed the mist net that hunter used, I was trying to occupy these hunting places and release all the birds that I caught in the mist net. And then the next day I came, actually the hunter just removed all the nets, so I couldn't do the further survey. But for the bycatch and the other types of nets, you can actually just release the birds. And also, I think what I always keep in mind, detecting the issue, the problem is very important, but even more important is to find a solution. So it's like, how are you going to suggest the authorities or practitioners to deal with this issue? I think it's very important as well. With that, I'd like to thank my co-authors, collaborators, and also a lot of field assistant volunteers were getting involved in this work. And thank you so much. I want to emphasize that, I think after doing this work, I'm more and more convinced that this direct mortality of shorebirds can be a really overlooked issue. So I really hope that these methods can be used to do similar research in other types, other portion of the flyway. So feel free to reach out to me if anyone who is interested in doing similar surveys in their own country. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Does anybody have any questions for Dan? Open to the floor for anybody on that. Can't see the chat. Clary, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, Dan, for the presentation. Extremely interesting and very relevant to the work that has been going on for many years, 20 years, here in Cyprus, which is a country where a lot of illegal trapping with nets is taking place. And around the world, it's probably one of the very few which has a standardized monitoring program of catching with nets. And a lot of these questions you asked at the end have been asked here as well. And after many years, the methodology has been refined very much with help, great help from the RSPB, the BirdLife partner in the UK, which set up the methodology from the beginning. So now it's a proper randomized, stratified survey that goes quickly in the field, because here, I don't know what it's like there, but the trappers can be very aggressive if they catch you. So you have to go in, do the survey very quickly, not get caught, and get out and do your estimation. And then on the basis of the monitoring, they do the extrapolation. But it has to be stratified and random in order to be able to do a good extrapolation. But in terms of your last question, I think it's important to be very clear about this methodology and how you do it, because when you get to start to use it for advocacy and say there are so many thousand birds caught and that's a problem, then the first thing you find is that the methodology is attacked. So if you are not very clear on the methodology and how you've come to it, which I'm sure you are, but I'm just saying that, with the experience that we have in Cyprus, this is the first thing that is attacked. And we had to jump through many, many loops with the authorities in order to persuade them that the methodology was actually quite good, maybe the best around for monitoring illegal trapping, which is not easy, as we know. And then only that they started to realize that actually there were as many as 2.5 million birds being caught every year, passerines. But we're talking about huge numbers, and then gradually enforcement started. Now the numbers are very low. So congratulations for the work, extremely important. And if you want to get in touch with some people that have done this work, I'm sure Vicky can put you in touch, or because BirdLife Cyprus has really got a lot of experience of doing all this monitoring. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. I think that actually leads into Vicky very well then, since she has her hand raised.
Thanks very much. Really, really enjoyed your presentation, Dan. Thank you very much, and enjoying these workshop series generally. I just wanted to ask a question about the razor clam farmers. So this is bycatch, but are they then going on to eat or sell the birds, was one thing I wanted to know. And I just wanted to check, so this is an illegal activity within China, or this is not illegal if it's bycatch? And then thirdly, I wanted to understand, because this is a really useful method that you've used with the drones to cover the net area on the mudflats. Have you looked at kind of trying to train local authorities to also use these drones so that they could use it for, you know, monitoring and enforcement themselves? Because that seems to be a potential opportunity here.
Thank you so much. So I will go with the first. I think, I mean, I travel extensively among these real clam farms in southeastern China, and I didn't. So I think, well, most of the places, I would say, there's no people who will, you know, eat the birds. Just left the birds will die. But I also encountered one of the places, people told me that some of the local people will also take the birds and eat them. But this is a very few cases. And this, I would not say it's a hunting, and I will also not say it's a bycatch. I think it's because a bycatch is unintentional catch, right? But this is more like a human wildlife conflict, because I think, because I mean, obviously they want to prevent these birds to eat their crops, like many other types of many other like conflicts, like in the agriculture systems. So in China, I think it is illegal because they are using the the nets to capture birds, but it's not like a hunting. So right now, I think a new policy like a wildlife protection law recently have added some more clarification about how to deal with this conflict. So it's like the local government need to like kind of come up with ways to compensate the loss of the say economic crops. But I don't know whether this will be very effective on the ground. So it's just a policy. So previously it was kind of treated as illegal hunting, but right now I think they have more specific requirements about how to deal with this conflict, I think. And then for the drone, yeah, I mean, because I survey different types of the nets. For other types of nets, it's okay. We just go there and measure the length of nets. But for this one, it's very difficult. So we come up with a way to actually, like the transect that we use is huge, but because there's no boundary of the nets, so we don't know like how many nets we were surveying. So we just use a like a transect, like a 100 meter wide, and then the length is different, So I use the drone to measure, but right now we didn't get in touch with the authorities. This is pretty much the funding problem issue, like stage. But I think in next steps, we'll get in touch with But right now, we are working with a local NGO, like the local bird association, to trying to like mitigate this issue. Particularly, we have a paper will publish this year, and they will use this paper to work with authority to do such things. I think the main issue is not to monitor them, it's just to try to find a way to mitigate the mortality, right? So I think we have some very clear like intervention suggestions, which is to take down the nets when they harvest the real clam seed, which is actually before the migrants come. So actually, after they set up the net around November, and then they harvest the rare clams before April, and then they don't take down the nets. They just left the nets on the mud flat. The reason is probably they need to hire people. They need to spend money to remove the net, so they don't want to do so. So I think if they can remove the nets just right after they harvest the birds, I mean, these tens of thousands of birds can be just saved, right? They don't have to die. I think those are the clear step, that the first step that we want to get in touch with the authority to do the first. But still, you know, for the wintering birds, there are some conflict during this time. So we still need to find other solutions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Are there any other questions from anybody? Feel free to type in the chat. I think that was very insightful. There's a lot of data there that is good to see that coming out of China, at least to understand the problem better, since it is so complicated. So, you know, thank you so much, Dan. So now that we've talked a little bit more about net surveys, this actually, his last question about what we should do actually leads really well into what I'm about to talk about, which is motivation surveys, actually. When we talk about motivation surveys, a lot of times people will talk about theory of change. So that's actually where I'm going to start, because we need context for how to actually do these things. So a lot of times people just ask, like, what is it really? And I think that there is, it's overly complicated by some people, you know, because it's related to theory for planned behavior and all these other things that people overemphasize sometimes when you're trying to explain it to somebody who might not be as familiar with these concepts. It's just easier to boil them down to the most critical things. So critically, to understand it, it's really just a framework for helping guide your community engagement and change. And usually they are divided into kind of 4 kinds of actions that you can take. You can disincentivize illegal behavior. That's where your legal framework comes in, for instance. You can have incentives for wildlife stewardship. You can decrease the cost of living with wildlife. So that's like the conflict, for instance, that happens between wildlife and people in some cases. And also to support livelihoods unrelated to wildlife consumption if the issue is direct consumption. And we see this often impacting what we actually choose to do for outreach, right? So choosing which one to focus on will be kind of the, if we succeed or not with our conservation outcome that we're trying to get. So you actually do need to understand the local community that you are working with first, and it is necessary to do some pilot studies in some cases to get more of that information if you don't know anything about them. Now, what you see oftentimes when you read, reports on this or read proposals, they will kind of sum it down to results change, which is representing the theory of change in a linear fashion. And I think when I tell people, it's inputs and outputs and activities, like it kind of doesn't really make sense. So I had this example that somebody found that I know and it was a great way to put it together because it's very cute. And so the issue is that you have some cold penguins, and your input is that you have some yarn, and the activity is that you're going to knit them to make sweaters as the output. And then the outcome is that the penguins wear the sweaters. And so they are now warm, right? So you're solving the problem that you're being presented with. But when we think about this is the overly simplistic version. The kind that you'll see in a lot of reports is more like this, when you see this top line of everything else, and your surveys for motivation to help decide what you're actually going to do, right? So if you're starting out saying, okay, I'm going to do this input where I'm going to raise awareness, we're going to do community meetings, and it's going to help us, help the hunters know that, bird hunting is legal. It helps them understand why birds are important. And all of that leads into the outcome of fewer hunters want to hunt birds. And on the other side, you also have people maybe working in law enforcement, where they are going to train new forest patrols, and those forest patrols will apprehend more hunters there. And also they'll confiscate gear that is related to hunting, such as like traps or nets or anything else. And then fewer hunters can hunt the birds then. And all of these are with the goal of reducing hunting of birds ultimately, right? And so you can go back and then interview them and understand how effective it is. So you can do an evaluation of your actual activity. So let's say you went back to interview the hunters, and now 80% of them know that's illegal. And so 50% of them said that they stopped hunting because that was enough of a disincentive for them to stop hunting. So it's really something that's going to then contribute to the overall desire for you to have fewer birds offered for sale in the local market, and ultimately increasing those bird populations overall in where you're working, right? So it's actually very easy to put things into these little kind of silos once you understand what you're actually looking for in each one of them. And I think a lot of people who have actually done this work recently have looked to the model from RARE, which is an NGO that has done a lot of this work on behavioral change in the environment, especially because they work with a lot of local communities. In the folder that I shared with you in the Dropbox, that is from 2014, it says RARE Theory of Change for Community-Based Conservation. That is actually this particular document that goes into each of the steps that they have for when they have this program. You can go on their website now and you can still see their general model for how they work. But I have found that recently this document is kind of difficult to find for some reason. So I did include that in the Dropbox so it's easier for people to have access to. But basically, it sums up to just different steps that you have to take in order to actually work with your communities. And I'm kind of assuming that you have already completed step 0, which is identifying what your conservation issue is. So you have to do a stakeholder analysis. Like I mentioned, you want to know something more about your community. If you have a scientist who's actually from there, then perhaps they already know and they already know who the stakeholders are and makes your life a little easier. You need to identify what your goals are. So like we've mentioned repeatedly, you really need to be clear on what your objectives and your goals are before you go into doing it. And then you can actually do identifying and rating your threats. And there's actually a very clear description of how you can do that in the document that is from RARE. And that lets you understand what your priorities are. And so you can then map the problems for where you should actually try to intervene. And that allows you to create that theory of change, which gets you that results chain to see what you should be doing to get to the outcome that you desire. And you can go back and evaluate the impact of it. So to make this more concrete, I am going to talk about an example that I've worked on, which is on bats, not birds, unfortunately. It's a different flying animal, but I'm more familiar with bats. And so I would rather speak to something that I have direct experience with. And that is with bats, particularly flying foxes, which are these giant fruit bats that are found in the old world tropics. So you have this very interesting problem in Indonesia where every single island has somebody consuming bats. In some places, in Sumatra and Java, people eat them as medicine. In Maluku and in Lesser Sundas, which is like Bali and Lombok, you have people that will actually eat them as like snacks, kind of with like a drinking party. But then in places like Kalimantan or Sulawesi or Papua, you actually have people who eat them as sustenance. And the problem is actually very severe in Sulawesi, where there's these very large markets to sell bats to people. And no one had really actually gone out to understand this problem there yet, especially because Eastern Indonesia, the research there was already lacking compared to Western Indonesia, just because of access to resources being not as accessible. So we went out and we did market surveys to understand the volume, but also we went and did semi-structured interviews to understand these motivations, because we really wanted to try and resolve the problem in some way and come up with an outreach program as an outcome that would actually succeed. And so fortunately, I met a student when I was in Indonesia on a Fulbright, and she is from there originally. And so we met at her university, at University of Indonesia, where she was an undergraduate at the time. And we started working on this problem where she had said to me, hey, you know, I know these people locally, and my mom is from there also. So she also speaks all these different dialects that people speak. So we have a really good opportunity to use a local guide that we would not have had access to otherwise. And so when we went out there, we were able to understand, one, where's the source of them? And so the percentage that you see over each of these provinces is actually the source, according to the people who are the hunters and the vendors who know where they're coming from. And we did find actually that the network is very much closed in to this area in Northern Sulawesi, where there are key markets that are located in each of these regencies. And P is pasar, which means market. And so each one of these is a market that is fairly large, with 4 of them being some of the largest ones with the most connectivity to hunter networks or to inputs from other places. And generally speaking, there is a very much a lack of awareness for the fact that this is actually very unsustainable. We had interviewed the students who are at the university also there locally, and they were very aware of these things, but the general population is not. And then when you actually look at why it is, it's because that peak consumption is tied to Christian holidays and celebrations. So this area is actually really historically interesting because it is a part of Indonesia that was heavily influenced by the Dutch. And so there are more people that are Christian here than they are Muslim. And so using this identifier of eating what's called daging unik, which is unique meat, it just is anything that's not from a domestic animal. So they use this as a way to kind of identify as Christian sometimes because it's not, they don't have these same rules about eating halal and things like that. So there are clearly some very strong cultural and identity reasons for why people do this. And so when we talked to people, we knew that this was going to be a very difficult problem to resolve. But also when we actually talked to people, it was very clear that there was also an age cohort, difference where the older cohort was very much used to eating it. They always eat it. A lot of the times when you talk to younger people, they were just like, I could take it or leave it. They don't really care. They're just kind of used to doing it, so they do it anyway. But in general, because of these older cohorts, it really need to point it to a work of, you have to go to trusted institutions. So working with churches or with the government or some other point of authority, and because we can't really change their behavior as younger people, or as outsiders, as scientists, whatever it is, because it's already ingrained in that part of where they work. And so our model for how this works is that we did awareness raising campaigns, but we actually purposely targeted the local community leaders, and they had conversations with one another where they can then go back to their villages or the place that they work in and talk to people there. And as a result of that, in some of the local communities, they had hunting bans for bats. These are especially the places where there are roosts, large colonial roosts for some of these bats, where they will have hunters pass by. So if they don't let hunting happen, then it can't happen because they will restrict access, basically. There's also an MOU signed with the local government to stop selling protected or endangered species or endemic species at some of the markets. And that also helps with reducing that availability. And so, fewer hunters can hunt the bats as a result of that. And then on the law enforcement side, we also had roost patrol teams created. And this was engaging actually with a local youth group that was like a nature enthusiast group. And they, love hiking outside, and they were able to actually just help us monitor that, because even just having that patrol team was already enough of a deterrent. It didn't need to necessarily be somebody who had arresting authority, because this is at a very local level. And they actually did find more hunters anyway sometimes, and, turn them away. And also they saw sometimes some traps, and they got rid of them. They threw them away. They cleaned up a lot of the garbage that was there because of that. And again, fewer hunters can hunt the bats. And so overall, you have the reduced hunting of bats. And that means there are fewer bats that are offered for sale in the market. But, that doesn't create the intrinsic value sometimes that you want for doing the conservation work, right? So there is an aspect to our model that I didn't talk about before, which is when we did the awareness raising campaigns, we also discussed it in the context of how bats are really important as pollinators for durian. And durian is something that is beloved in the region, obviously, right? So especially in this area, actually in Sulawesi, they have literal truckloads that they can, back up out of cars to sell durian everywhere. And people didn't believe necessarily if a bat is a pollinator until you took camera trap photos, really show them like a real image, right? And so doing the research is something that is very much not going to happen just from the local community. And so as scientists, you can go in and actually raise awareness just by bringing these people with you to do your research, and then to go out and go to the markets and talk to the people who are selling durian and tell them about these things, because then they understand that the bats are very important. And that helps develop this positive attitude towards bats, because people love durian. And so if you love durian, you have to love bats. And that also helps us get evidence for how much the bats have economically on the region. Because durian is such a profitable cash crop, there is a huge economic impact for losing them, because a lot of times these are not very professionalized durian farms. These are semi-wild durian that they're actually selling. So it's not at this level that you find in Thailand, where you have these huge plantations. It's still literally a durian tree in the middle of nowhere. And then, people pick all of those and sell them. And then there's maybe 14 of them on somebody's property, and he sells all the ones from them, right? So it's not as organized in the same way. And so you are reliant on these bats to actually do pollination and to make sure that the trees are healthy and have genetic variety and everything else that you actually want in your plant community. So that actually leads to fewer people wanting to hunt bats. So now we're giving them reasons for why they shouldn't hunt them. And it reduces the overall demand and consumption of bats because of that. So that's something that is really important when you're trying to reduce how much of it's coming from the market. And so we have actions that are then, so the previous part shows you on the supply side, we work mostly with people who are at the roost, who are working with the bats and trying to protect them at the source. And then here on the demand side, to work with people who are At the market's actually the ones who are requesting it and trying to reduce that demand, right? And so that reduces sale of bats at the market over time. So that's a very easy to understand model that like works. So I'm going to now talk about, though, also something that is done a lot, which is education for children that may not have worked out as well as we wanted it to, right? So this is actually a study that was also done with my student Scheherazade, but also with a local NGO called Tasikoki Wildlife Rescue and Education Center. And they do a lot of outreach in the area, or they do a lot of other programs in the area in Sulawesi. So they are very familiar with this area. They are not new, so they're enough ingrained into the community where it's not weird for them to go into some of these schools to talk to kids. And the goal again is building this awareness raising campaign, and doing storytelling and environmental education, especially because this environmental education was something that these kids did not have access to otherwise. There's no consistent science resources going in that give them the opportunity to learn about some of these things. So us going out there, it's not just about the bats, but you talk about the forest health and all these other animals as well. And you're hoping that means that these children will develop a positive attitudes towards the bats you're working on, and that they understand why bats are important, because you're going to do this as part of the curriculum that is at school. And that is supposed to hopefully reduce the desire for children to eat the bats, and then that reduces the overall consumption because you're reducing an aspect of the demand. So hopefully that also means reducing sale of bats over time. And I mentioned this example specifically because there are so many programs often that people target children on, but it's not that they're bad. It's that you will see from this why you need to consider more things and dimensions when you're doing these to make sure that they're effective. So they went out there to 4 schools for middle schoolers, it's 7th graders, in the largest bushmeat market. So from the previous study that we did, we knew where the biggest markets were. And so they purposely found schools in those areas. And, overall, the education worked very well. There was a significant increase in their understanding about flying foxes as beneficial to forests. They had a significant increase in understanding about how bats are beneficial for people. But the outreach didn't result in this consistent, sustained behavior change that we wanted, which is that, they don't eat bats. It was very inconsistent in that some students did actually say that they learned from this not to eat bats. It convinced their families that they didn't want to eat bats. There's a huge spike in week 3 because it coincided with a holiday also. So some of those families just ignored their kids and just did it anyway. And that points at one of the weaknesses sometimes of these kinds of awareness campaigns that don't have other activities partnered with them. It's very necessary for us to understand, why is it that this didn't work, right? What are the essential components to that behavior change? So the barriers for children usually is that they don't dictate what they get to eat. Their mom tells them what to eat. They don't actually get to really have any say sometimes. The other problem could just be that the children were not able to successfully communicate with their parents about the conservation message. So that could either be they could not explain it completely, or they did explain it, but their parents didn't listen to them, or they just forgot because they're kids. Then that's normal. So these are aspects of working with children that you have to account for when you're making activities that are for awareness raising. So to do better, one way is to also include having a discussion with the parents as part of the activity, as part of one of the activities that you do after you do the education as well. And that actually gives them practice for how they communicate with one another and other core skills as children that are very important. They can get more comfortable talking about science and about environmental issues, for instance, or also just include a parent-child conservation day. So invite the moms of these kids also on the day that you're doing some sort of education, and have it be a fun thing basically for the parents to do, and not just only depend on the children to convey that message to them. So, we can improve upon a lot of these activities that we're doing overall when we're doing awareness raising by going out and actually understanding the motivations behind, what these kids are doing, right? And so that's part of the reason why you need to do motivation surveys. So very quickly going to just mention all the different people that funded this, because these were multiple projects over many different years. And if any of you have questions, there is Shara's email on there, and also Wendy's email, who are the 2 who did the 2 different studies I just talked about. And I will now actually very quickly then get us to, because I want to just make sure people have time. Does anybody have any questions actually first before I move on to the next part? I can't see anything in chat, so okay. There are no questions. So I think that one way for you to see how these surveys are done also is in the different kinds of surveys I shared with you in the Dropbox. So I sent that link to everybody, but I will also bring this up on screen again, just so it's easier for everybody. And okay, so one of the first things that I mentioned is how to actually construct these questionnaires, right? And so you'll find that a lot of people rely on this document, which is Asian 2006. And this is in the folder also. This is not a example of a questionnaire, but this is a brief description of a theory of planned behavior. And if you are super interested in the more sociology side of it, this is the thing for you to read, because this actually goes into what's, these very specific terminology that's being used in sociology. So like subjective norms, normative norms, like what are the things in society that push you to do something? What are your core beliefs, and how does that create intention in the person and create that behavior? So this is a very technical document about how to actually create that research. And so if you're really interested in it, I suggest you read this first as a way to understand where all these other models come from for how they create the questionnaires. In the latter half of it, it actually goes into different examples of how to construct these questions. These are all on a Likert scale. So basically a scale for you to agree and disagree. Usually they recommend that you do that, because if you have something that's just a yes or a no, people will often just kind of like go with whatever this seems like the most convenient thing to do. And also, you want to make sure that you're writing questions that are not leading people, and you want to have them be the ones to volunteer any sort of information, right? So you can look at that document if you're very interested. One of the most important points in it is also to administer a pilot questionnaire. So when you first make it, go out and test it on a small population, go out and make sure your surveyors also understand it, and then have the feedback for you to modify before you bring it to, the larger study that you're doing, just to make sure that these questions make sense to people. There's no ambiguity about what you're asking, and to make sure that they're very, very clear on what is happening as a participant in this study. And this actually gets at a more generalized point that I wanted to make about like example questionnaires, about some key points that you could do. And this is something that I think is actually very important, just to very quickly go over. I don't remember how to do this full screen. But basically, you want to keep questionnaires simple, right? So you want to minimize the amount of thinking that is required to understand the questions. And that can be something like, if you're talking to them, don't use complicated words, basically. So make it very simple. Each item should actually measure only one underlying dimension, so that if you have an answer for it, you can actually go out and take that, make it into data, and then process the data and analyze it later. Do something that doesn't require too much reading or listening, because your interviewee sometimes can get bored if you ask for something that's like a 3-sentence long question that doesn't get anywhere. Your surveyors might forget what it actually said. And also just make sure that it keeps into consideration the knowledge of the respondents. So an example of this is that when we collect data on what bats people encounter in a market, even for other bat biologists, they may not know exactly what species it is, but at least being able to identify if it's a fruit bat or another kind of bat, like an insect bat of some sort. We give them a general picture of this is what that means. And so if you see a bat that kind of looks like one of these, then just pick one of these. You don't have to identify the species. Another example of how we kept questionnaires simple is with the kids, for instance. You cannot really use very complicated words because they don't understand what that means, right? So we actually gave these worksheets basically for them, where they had stickers of the different kinds of meats that they could eat. And then they just tell us like what they ate during that week, and they just fill them in for each of them. And that was a very fun activity for them to do also. So they were very engaged in it. In the assessment of the children also, we had a pre and a post assessment where we didn't ask them to really explain things in like complicated words, but ask them to draw things, ask them if they were able to identify certain animals. And I just illustrate if there are conceptually things that are too difficult for them to explain in full sentences, that they can just draw it basically. So like if there is a question here about like how does bat benefit people, they can just draw durian, for instance, right? So something very simple is really useful for if your audience is not as sophisticated in some cases, but also just if you wanted to save time, if you have questions that are relating, for instance, mostly to pregnant women, you wouldn't ask that to men, for instance. So you just make sure when you're interviewing people, you take that into consideration and skip over things that are not relevant. And when you're asking questions in those surveys, to actually order the questions appropriately. So you start with very straightforward questions about non-sensitive issues, which you'll see in the examples I'll give, and then you save the more sensitive questions for the end. And so that gives you an opportunity to actually develop a rapport with the person, right? You're having a conversation with them and getting to know them. You're not just like taking a clipboard with the questions and just going down the order. You're letting a conversation flow, and you're having those conversations in a way that will hopefully be informative to what you want to find, but also not uncomfortable for the person that you're interviewing. And then also the order question can actually influence how attitudes are perceived, right? So you don't want to ask things in a way where it might make somebody feel uncomfortable and suddenly they become very guarded and they don't want to tell you what exactly they think. It might have other impacts that you are not fully conscious of otherwise, right? So that matters a lot. And if you look at some of the examples that I gave, the one that I'll start with that is actually relevant to something I've already talked about is the Harrison 2011 one. So this is in Appendix A of that particular document. And this is actually the survey that we modified for our bat survey in Sulawesi. They had a very particular interest, though, in disease risk and in understanding if people were aware that there is some disease risk. And so they had a lot of questions that were related to that. But they also gave a script for any interviewer also to, be able to start in some way that, if they're having trouble starting, this is how the minimum information that you should convey to the person. And these kinds of things are useful because they had a lot of volunteers, for instance, on the ground that sometimes may not have the same training as, somebody who is already doing conservation for a very long time. And so this is just a way to get them more comfortable by, giving them a handy script that if you really do blank, that at least you can just look at this and remember what you're supposed to say. And then they asked, demographic questions first, for instance. And then as you go down, they actually talked about, hunting sites. They talked about how many bats they caught or how many they sold. These are very much geared towards hunters, not towards consumers. And so they can be more specific in that sense. And they also asked about, where and how they did it, right? And so you can get at these questions about how people are functionally interacting with the bats and know where the landscapes are and what other spots that you actually need to be looking out for. And then at the end, they actually do ask a bunch of questions related to related to disease as well at the end. So they are really interested in that aspect of disease risk. So like Ding-Li mentioned earlier, there are dimensions of this that are of interest to other people in other fields. And that actually is something that is very important to be aware of for anything that you're working on when you go out to survey, because that might actually be an opportunity for you to find a new funder or a new partner to work with. The models I showed you even for how you think about those inputs and outcomes, for instance, are ways that you will increasingly see when you look for potential funders that are in development banks or they're from conservation organizations that want you to demonstrate what exactly is the impact of your work. And if you can clearly articulate what it is that you are doing and what is the outcome of that is relevant to the overall goal, then you can make a stronger case for why somebody should fund you. And so if you can think through that process and actually put it on paper to show them, that is actually a really easy way to improve the quality of some of the proposals that are being put in as well. So keep that in mind. Aside from this bat one, there were a couple other ones that I wanted to point out, which are important, but I'm just quickly also going to show there is a different variable. There's a different one for this one for vendors also. And if you go to the end, you'll see that most of the questions are the same, except for they have this one section about customers that was not in the hunter one. So you can scroll through some of these to think about what kinds of different things people ask. If you look at the McAvoy 2019 one, they actually had it as two separate documents in their supplementary, where one of them is specific to the hunter and the other one is more for the market survey overall. So this would be one where you're going out and just surveying in the market and you're not looking for hunters specifically. And this is an example of one that was filled out, for instance, in their supplementary material. I'm including all these because a lot of these papers are actually open access, but for some reason the supplementals with the questionnaires are not. So if there turns out to be another paper that you really are interested in, it happens to overlap with something that you want to get more into and you cannot access the supplementary information, please feel free to contact me and I'll try to, get that to you. Here's another one that's more recently done with disease, and this is specifically for COVID, actually, where the researchers here went out and collected a huge amount of data to understand if people actually change their behavior as a result of that. And if you look at their survey instrument, which is this entire document, this is all, about like where people live. So these are all the sites that they went to, and then all the demographic information, like I mentioned before. And then they get into how much they know about coronaviruses, and then also about how people think about the closure of the markets and things of that nature. So another important and very topical disease angle that might be relevant to people who are working on wildlife and may want to find different potential partners and collaborators who are working in those aspects as well to get different kinds of funding. So yeah, I encourage you to take a look at that. And there are a couple other ones where they're actually not from this region. They're not on birds necessarily even, but they are relevant because they talk about wildlife parts. So in some of these cases, you have more of a difficult time in a market to try to identify something you can't. It's in this case, it's actually wildlife parts in Ghana, and in the other one, which is Williams, it's actually lion bones. And these are actually very different also, because the lion bone one actually targeted scientists who are already working in the region, and they sent it out to people who had a more familiarity. In some cases, they didn't really go to the market. And you'll find that there are a lot of studies where people actually know there are experts that may have worked on this, and have familiarity with the region, but they don't have the data from them. They've never asked these people these things. And so they're going out and actually purposely asking them. So these could be people who might work on national parks, for instance, where they have a great familiarity with lions and poaching, but they might have never actually been participant in any sort of survey related to consumption of lion parts, right? So they purposely reach out to a population that clearly has a regular interaction with the lions in some way, and also potentially with the lion derivatives. And then they actually ask people to fill out, what are the things that you see the animals being used for, because they wanted to get more information on that as well. So I gave a bunch of different examples of that sort that you can look at if you are curious. And then I also just included another one that is from a study that was actually in China also. So this is from Southwest China, and it talks about social norms in wild bird hunting. And this is a really good example of how they try to also simplify their survey, where they actually had, pictures for each of the things to make it look not as uninteresting, basically. And also in some cases to give pictures of the animal so people can have an easier time identifying it. They had different questions related to, if in these cases, some of the men were the ones who were going out hunting and capturing the animals. And so they actually asked them more about that. If they did, they had options where they can select those. And that helps them get more information just about what's going on out there. And all of this actually goes into, like I mentioned before, the ASGEN one, where there is a bigger topical question about social norms and societal norms, and they can ask questions related to that. And their paper actually talks through specifically what those norms are that they are putting into the model. So they have a very, I think, very accessible type of study that if people are interested in that, this is probably the closest to the type of work that people are doing that is directly related to what we're doing here also in the ITTEA. So I encourage people to take a look at that. And I also included, where is this? Is it opening? I also included a document, which is the Traffic's Expert Opinion Review. And this is from a while ago now, this is from 2008, but I think it's still very relevant. And it's about how they actually conducted their expert opinion. The file is very big, so apparently I'm having trouble opening it right now. But you can take a look at that. These are just some base examples for how you can construct a survey. And I actually encourage people to go through this and look through, for questions that might be of interest to you, for instance, in the future, if you're working on these kinds of things. I know we're nearing the end, but I will very briefly touch on a couple of online survey issues. But I very want to quickly give everybody an opportunity. Does anybody want to ask any questions before I move on to that? Are there any questions from anybody? Yes, no, maybe so. Sorry, I can't see the chat, so you're gonna have to just tell me if there are anything. Okay. Okay, if there are no questions, then I'll just very briefly talk about these parts related to online surveys. So recently there has been a greater interest in the e-commerce trade of wildlife parts and wildlife in general. And you are going to increasingly see two different kinds of studies, I think, which is One where people do web scraping, where they, look for keywords that then go through websites like Etsy or Amazon or eBay, and they like gather all the different listings for certain animals. Or two, people will also go out and they will go onto different social media platforms and they will monitor groups that they found that are doing wildlife trade on whatever specific animal that they're interested in, or a general store that's selling all kinds of wildlife in some cases, and then compiling that information on that. And I say that this is something that's coming up more recently, because even when you look up the number of papers that are for it, a lot of them are very recent. So, so here's an example. Oh, I gotta share my screen again. So here's an example that I'm gonna just very quickly show. Oh, this is the social ones one. Where did it go on my screen? Something happens when I switch it. Hold on a second. Something happens when I share the screen on Zoom that makes it not appear properly. I don't know what. That's very strange. Let me try that again. Move that. Okay, so for instance, you have this study that came out a few years ago that was looking specifically on social media, and they were looking at Asian otters, which are a globally threatened taxa. So they actually went and did that for 5 Facebook groups, and they like monitored it over a period of time to get that information. And now that level of information might not even be enough for the volume that we're seeing increase, because over the course of the past few years, e-commerce has exploded compared to even just, when this was published in 2018, especially over the pandemic, where people were getting more used to buying things online. And so there's more of an interest in that. There's a few more papers now even on trade in insects, trade in reptiles, and trade in just other pets, also like exotic pets as well, like fish, for instance. So you'll find that most of these are in open access places. I think a lot of the authors, generally speaking, are aware that the issue that they're working with impacts people who are often in countries, source countries, where they don't have as easy access to scientific information. So they try to make it shareable and try to make it accessible. So a lot of these are just freely available. But I will point out that also that this particular study relies a lot on the fact that Vincent worked for a very long time with traffic. And so he has access to information that some other people might not have. So, is of interest. The other way that actually people collect information online is having a passive way of collecting information. So you see people making apps, for instance, where people can report, I saw this particular animal being sold in this market. It's very similar to when last week when Roman was talking about, having the INAT project where people can send in things like related to where they find these mortalities. In the case of bats, for instance, that I work with, we have this portal, for instance, where we actually have a website that allows people to actively go into it, and they can, click on submit data. And it leads into, and you can build this with any survey tool, but this is built by the PhD students working on this in ArcGIS. And they made it very easy. So they made it like you can just pick where you are on the map, and then they tell you to fill in these little radio button things, as many as you want. And there's different pathways also. This is actually further into it already. This is after I would have selected, so if I go back one, I would have selected persecuted or consumed or trade, and it leads to different questions. So it leads to branching questions. And I actually encourage people that if they're going to do these types of passive collections online from, a targeted community, that you think of how to actually get more value out of that particular online survey. By like, for us, we're doing these branching ones because we want people to give us more context and not just, they're consuming bats. And that's something that I don't see a lot with online surveys that are passively collecting information. And so if, people are interested in online surveys that are created of this sort, I am happy to talk to you about that in greater detail. Just want to make sure we stay on time because we only have a few minutes left. Are there any questions for anybody? Because I do need to wrap up then. I don't want to have us over time. I cannot see anything. Hold on. I have to open my other screen.
So far, no.
Okay. Sorry. I can't see a lot of things. So today is a very weird day for that. Okay. Well, I think that if there is anything from anybody else that you would like to mention or share about any if you've done surveys before for anything that we've talked about and you would like to actually share what you've done before, please feel free to send them to me and I can include them on the website. You can, give us a little bit of context for it even in an email to me if you want to have that to share with everybody, and I can compile all those together to share with everybody. If there is anybody who has a specific interest in more technical aspects of doing analyses for these things, like if you feel like one of the major gaps is we can't do the online survey study because we don't have anybody that knows how to set up a script that can do web scraping. Like if there's an interest in something like that, or if, we do need to do this type of survey study, but our impediment is that we don't have anybody in our office that can do the level of data analysis as necessary. And so we need somebody to go out and learn how to use R to process all that data. That's something that you should let me know, because that might be a technical workshop that we can help host in the future. And hopefully, all of you feel comfortable reaching out and letting me know if you have any questions, ideas, suggestions that you want us to go into more, because I want to encourage people to actually do more of this work. And it ultimately, like in the spring, hopefully, after you've had some time to process everything we've talked about, plan doing some surveys out there and getting out and having a team to go out there and going to your supervisors and telling them, I'm going to apply for funding for this project. I'm going to go out and actually do this work. So yeah, I will follow up with everybody in a few months, but also I will have a follow-up in the next couple of weeks that will summarize everything that we've said. I will put all the resources on the website. The Dropbox that I have right now that I've shared, I'll leave that there. And if anything else comes up where people have more suggestions for resources that they want me to share, I will also put that on there. I think for the most part, most of the papers that I've referred to are open access, but a couple of them are not. And if that's the case, I'll also put them in the Dropbox. But I'll also link every single one of them on the website so that people can easily access if they forget where it is. Great. So thank you very much for coming. I will give you all one last opportunity if anybody wants to say anything, any comments, anything else from the audience. Okay, so if there is nothing else, okay, well, then I will actually close our meeting. So thank you again for coming, everybody. I really appreciate it. I hope you feel prepared to design and carry out your own surveys, like I said. And if you have anything else you would like to ask about, please let me know, and I will send a link to everybody soon and keep in touch. Thanks.